Okay, good evening and welcome. My name's John Davis. I'm director of the Mile Group. This represents our 97th meeting. Before we begin, a very big thank you to our sponsors, our long-time friends at Hewlett-Packard, and also our co-sponsors, the City of London Corporation. Tonight's MEG is special for many reasons, not least because Nick is a good mate of the Mile Group and myself. I think we met in 2007 when you were bossing the National Security Strategy Secretariat. Is that correct? Now, I don't know if any of you in the audience know any civil servants, but certainly that 07-10 period, people seem to age. I don't know if you noticed that. I don't know, but certainly I did. But back to your normal self now. Look at. Really pleased that Nick agreed to this. I mean, we've had retired mandarins in the past, but this is our first serving ambassador. What a posting.
I think it's slightly high risk now, John, the way you're putting that. But go on.
Her Majesty's ambassador to the Republic of Yemen. Yeah. Jinx tells me you've been living in a shipping container with 4 SBS chaps for company. You're going to disabuse this. You're going to talk about foreign becomes domestic. I give you the diplomat, securocrat, linguist, novelist, bon vivant, all-round Renaissance man, Nicholas Dunster Hopton.
Right. Thank you, John.
I told you we've been doing research.
Yes,
you managed to find your middle name. That was it.
Well, that threw me completely. Yes, it's great to be here, John. Thank you for the invitation and the warm welcome. And I'm sorry, Professor Peter Hennessy's not here tonight, but please pass my best to him. A great figure in Lord Hennessy now, of course, in English political and social thinking. And it's great to come to the Mile End Group, a body I've been involved with since, as you say, 2008, when I first was brought along as part of my work on the national security strategy at the time. Can you hear me at the back? Are the microphones working and everything? Good. Okay. And thank you all for turning out tonight. Yes, I hadn't realised I was the first serving civil servant diplomat to appear before you, especially on the record. But this is the new open government freedom of information. I've got to watch my step, haven't I, John? Well, yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and also to be at Queen Mary's University, of course, which has, since I first started coming here 5 years ago, it never ceases to impress me with its dynamism, energy. And the Mile End Group represents all that is best about Queen Mary's University. I think you're now in the top 10, is that right? Or thereabouts?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Going from strength to strength. Why not? So, and it's great to see members of my family, who I haven't seen for quite a long time, some of them actually. Including,
you've been with the SBS guys, right?
Yes, exactly. I just got in this week, and including my father-in-law, who's a professor at Cambridge. So he's down here to learn how it's really done. So, the talk title that John suggested to me, which seemed eminently sensible at the time, is Foreign Becomes Domestic, the work of the British ambassador to Yemen. Now, the Mile End Group, of course, has very strong relations or strong interest in the history of the Blair period. So I wasn't surprised when John came up with this, because it's essentially a reference to something the former Prime Minister said in his chapter in his book on Kosovo. And he talked about the categorization of policy into foreign and domestic has always been somewhat false. And that's really the theme I'm going to explore a little bit tonight. I should actually just break at this point to say the last time I saw Peter, of course, was when I was watching him doing television commentary on Baroness Thatcher's funeral. I'm not sure, am I allowed to mention former Tory Prime Ministers in Queen Mary's University, given...
We are New Labour, not Labour.
Okay. But of course, this was inspired by the vision of Clement Attlee, if I remember. So
he wasn't New Labour.
Yeah, so you're broadening out your horizons. He wasn't New Labour. So, but I think Margaret Thatcher is worth mentioning because she also understood how the foreign and domestic overlap. And if you just need to think about the Falklands, how useful a foreign military adventure can be when you're trying to deal with domestic problems at home. can distract attention. I mean, and that wasn't why she went, of course, but the foreign and domestic play an interlinked role all the time. And also her speech on the European Union, the Bruges speech I could mention, I think it was 1988, when she set out a manifesto which is still, if you like, playing out very strongly this week as well. And for Tory Prime Ministers tend to come into government doing their best to play down Europe as an issue. I think this Prime Minister tried to do that initially. It doesn't seem to be working too well at the moment, but it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. And of course, everything European these days is intrinsically domestic, given the way the two agendas overlap so much. Jeremy Hayward, the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Hayward, I think he's been to talk to you, or certainly...
We go to him.
You go to him, okay. You know you've arrived when the Mile End Group goes to you. Okay. Well, Jeremy Hayward came to the Foreign Office yesterday to talk to a conference of ambassadors, an annual conference we have. And he said something which struck me as relevant to this discussion. He said the FCO is the UK government overseas. Now, coming from someone with a Treasury background, strong civil service ethos, right at the top of it, I thought that was interesting. The FCO is the UK government overseas. So what I'm going to do this evening is talk for about half an hour, looking particularly at how true the Blair thesis is, and primarily doing it through my experience in Yemen recently. So I'll start with that second part of the title, a bit of context about what it's like to be an ambassador in a country like Yemen, and about my present role. There's a city, John, in the Arabian Peninsula where there are tall skyscrapers, Ferraris in the street, glamorous people, huge amounts of money flying around. That's not where I live, sadly. The difference between Dubai and Sana'a is 180 degrees. They're opposite ends of the spectrum. One, extremely wealthy, and Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, is the capital of the poorest country in the region. Just a few facts. 25 million people, that's the same size as Saudi Arabia, and by far bigger than all the other members of the GCC in the region. A mountainous country with plains around the edges and desert in the east. Ancient culture and cities. Sana'a dates back several thousand years. It claims to be one of the oldest inhabited cities on the earth. Some historians even suggest that the Ark stopped not far from Sana'a when it hit the top of a mountain. I'm not sure whether actually the facts can be used to bear that out, but it's a good story. And then the average per capita income is $1,000 per year. Now, if you compare that to the richest country in the region, which is Qatar, which is $110,000 per year, you can see the gulf between Yemen and its neighbours. And why is this? And well, there are lots of reasons, but this is a country where they have their own natural opium, true to the Marx thesis, and every afternoon a large proportion of Yemenis, have we got any Somalis in the room, or people know anything about Somalia? Because it's a very similar situation. The Yemenis and the Somalis chew gat. Now this is a habit which I didn't know much about before I got there. It's basically about chewing leaves off a bush. It sounds very unattractive. It is pretty unattractive. You feel a little bit like a ruminant whilst you're doing it, but it is how Yemenis pass their time. And after a few hours, they rise up a level. They reach a trance-like state because it has certain hallucinogenic properties. It's legal in the UK. It's illegal in Saudi Arabia. It's illegal in the US. It's very legal in Yemen. And without this daily pastime, Yemen's problems would be exacerbated given the state in which most people live. The other thing to say about Yemen is the guns. After the US, it's the second highest number of guns, weapons per capita of any country in the world. And actually, which reminds me of, there's an Eddie Izzard line on this, guns and people. And he said, they say that guns don't kill people, people kill people, but I think the guns have something to do with it. And I mention that because you can't talk about Yemen without being aware that guns pervade everything, and every person feels naked without a gun in Yemen, or a great big dagger, which they wear around their waist at all times, the men. And to such an extent that when I come back to the UK and get off the plane at Heathrow, I look around me and I feel slightly kind of naked and worried, because I don't have lots of gun-toting bodyguards looking after my back. I'm getting used to it after a few days now, John, but it's a different kind of environment. The situation at the moment in Yemen is interesting. Some of you may have followed this, political transition going on. People put it in the bracket of the Arab Spring. If interested, we can talk about that during question and answer stage. Essentially, 2011 saw a transfer of power, breakdown, conflict between two sides of the military, teetering on the brink of civil war. They pulled back, international intervention stopped this, and there's a process sponsored by the GCC and the permanent members of the Security Council. The process is going forward towards the end of a 2-year political transition program, which will culminate in elections in February 2014. And a lot of my time is spent on that. The life in the embassy, perhaps a little bit more flavour before I get back to the main theme. The embassy, as you mentioned, we live in containers. It's a fort and has been since 2010. There were 2 attacks on my predecessors in the last couple of years. The ambassador in 2010 had a rocket-propelled grenade fired at the vehicle, and there was also a suicide attack on embassy vehicles. Neither succeeded in killing anybody in the embassy. They did cause quite a lot of damage, particularly to the suicide bomber, I'm afraid. And this is part of daily life in Yemen. And because of that, we live in a fort. The majority of my staff carry guns and are guards. We live communally. There are over 30 British staff in the embassy, and we eat together. There is a small bar, you'll be relieved to hear, John, so people are able to have a drink occasionally, but it's a pretty intense environment. And it's very similar to the setup in Helmand, or on a much smaller scale from, thanks John, or a much smaller scale from Kabul or Baghdad, which have big green zones, of course. I mean, if you try to picture it, for those who haven't been anywhere like that, it's a bit like a kind of Skegness campsite, but with a little bit more sunshine, I suppose. Well, you used the phrase to me, you described me as diplomatic trailer trash, and I think that's, it sometimes feels that might be a fair description, John. Yeah. 2 stories I'd like to use to illustrate why we're living in these conditions and operating in this environment. You may remember in Christmas 2009, a Nigerian called Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib tried to set fire to his underpants on an aeroplane. And he was known as the underpants bomber. And if he'd succeeded in this attempt, he would have blown up the aeroplane, and a huge number of passengers, mainly Americans and Brits, in the process. Fortunately, he was foiled. And he was set up to do this by Al-Qaeda, and this was when the world, I think, first really focused in on Yemen and realized that the main threat to Western interests, particularly urban centers such as London, New York, Washington, and the transport between them, comes from Yemen, from the ungoverned spaces in Yemen. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular, one particular bomber called Al-Asiri, who is still there, still operating, and has this particular expertise and determination to make that kind of very difficult to detect explosive. And there have been other cases since then of attempts which have again been foiled. The other incident I would mention to you is on 21st of May last year. There were military troops in the centre of Sana'a rehearsing for the National Day parade, marching up and down, mostly recruits. Beautiful day, centre of Sana'a, boom. And a suicide bomber who turned out to be the nephew of a brigadier general in the Yemeni army but had been indoctrinated by Al-Qaeda. A suicide bomber in uniform leapt into the middle of the recruits and blew himself up. And it was a mess, and almost 100 people were killed, mostly young lads. And this was right in the centre of Sana'a and demonstrated the deadly intention of Al-Qaeda. And there is still there's a monument, initially a kind of ad hoc monument with lots of photos, rather gruesome, set up, showing, for instance, I don't know if this is too much detail, but when a suicide bomber blows themselves up, their head normally flies off. It's bizarre and awful, but that's the truth. In this instance, the bomber's head flew 200 yards. It took them a while to find it, but that was how they were able to identify him. And there's a lot of pictures of this scattered, set up in a little monument. They're now building a permanent monument. So I tell you those two stories, and I should say actually on the victims who weren't killed, they were taken to two places, which Yemen is a place where if you're not crying, you're sometimes laughing, because it is bizarre. There's a hospital, a police hospital in the centre of Yemen where they took the victims, which has got a big sign out in front of it saying, "Typical police hospital." Typical, badly translated, and that's in English, badly translated from the Arabic word, which is the same word for model. So it should see model police hospital, typical police hospital. So some of the victims ended up there. The rest of them ended up across the Red Sea in Djibouti, which we don't have an embassy in Djibouti. The French kind of run it. From that, I've never been, but I'm told it essentially it's a port and a brothel masquerading as a country. But it's a grim place for anyone to end up. So that is where the rest of the victims of this bombing went. So as I say, it's never without its dark humour in Yemen, but it's always pretty tragic at the same time. And I tell you these two stories just to demonstrate that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still poses a real threat, both inside and outside the country, and that Western interests are high on the list of targets. Tony Blair, coming back to the thesis that he put forward, he argued that the foreign and domestic overlap increasingly because the world is very integrated, and increasingly so with modern technology and travel, and the way that we are joining up more and more through business and society, culture. And secondly, he said that media, international media, now has the ability, with the 24-hour news cycle, to turn an international event into a domestic crisis. And I think those two theses actually hold up quite well, and I'll explore that. I think you just need to think about the UK economy, increasingly dependent on what is happening in the world. We've always, over the last 20 years, European advocates in the Foreign Office have always argued that we need to stay within the EU because our economy is intrinsically tied to it. I think that actually can be argued on a much broader scale now. Our economy is increasingly tied to the emerging powers around the world as well. And the emerging powers as well, because there are a lot of countries which were basket cases and are now starting to move up the scale. And they're not there yet. They're not that interesting yet. Give them 10 years. The number of emerging powers will increase dramatically, I suspect.
Which ones would you be mentioning there? Which ones would you be thinking about?
Well, I think one of my colleagues yesterday was arguing that Ghana falls into that category now. It's not up there with the BRICS, with the Brazils and the Indias and Chinas. But it's a country that is reforming, is leading the way, and is heading in the right direction. So, and I think there are quite a lot of examples. You could look in different continents. And the statistic that struck me the other day is that non-OECD countries now account for 3/4 of global growth. So that's outside of the OECD. Very impressive. Now, for what this means for a UK ambassador is that we need to keep very close to Whitehall. We have many masters in the UK as well. You don't just get posts abroad and that's it. You have to keep your links very close with Whitehall departments. And doing that is as important to doing your job well as liaising with your host government. Clement Freud, he expressed it in a different context. He'd had an operation. Those of you who don't know Clement Freud, he was a food writer and wit, and he had an operation on his knee, and he couldn't walk properly. He went to a party and he was hobbling along, and an elegant lady came up to him and invited him to go upstairs and make love. And Clement Freud had to decline. He said, "Madam, I wish I could, but it'll be one or the other." And I think this is a little bit like the situation the Foreign Office finds itself in with foreign and domestic policy, except we cannot make the choice. We have no choice. We're not in Freud's position. We have actually to do both. We have to go upstairs and make love. We have to do both foreign and domestic. Now, I'm sorry, I'm lowering the tone a little bit there for you, John, but let me talk to you a little bit about some aspects of my work again where foreign overlaps with domestic. And in particular, I'll try and answer the question which Sue Cameron, if she was here, would definitely put to me. Why do we bother having an embassy costing almost £3 million a year in a far-flung, dusty place like Yemen, and where the risk is so high? It's a very good question, and British taxpayers, you deserve an answer. So, in brief, we do it for counter-terrorism reasons. I've already explained. This is right at the core of my embassy's work, keeping Britain safe, keeping you safe. And Yemen still is the base where the biggest threat to Western interests is emanating from. Secondly, consular. Kidnaps. Kidnapping is a traditional Yemeni pastime and a way of making money by the tribes. It's taken on a more deadly aspect in recent years because it's been tied in with the terrorism aspects and making money for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as well. And the UK embassy wants to keep British people from being kidnapped. We don't want them kidnapped because basically that would bring everything else to a halt. And when European partners have people kidnapped, we have to help them out, not least because we have better intelligence, better expertise in this field than most of them. You won't be surprised to hear that most other countries, their instinctive reaction is just to solve it and chuck money at it to sort it out. Now, this doesn't help anyone in the long run, and it just basically bankrolls Al-Qaeda at the moment in Yemen when that happens. So a couple of recent cases. There was a Swiss lady working for an NGO who was kidnapped by tribal. Yemen is a country full of different tribes, rival tribes. And she was kidnapped a year ago by tribes who then sold her on to Al-Qaeda. Very difficult to get any information on her for about a year. But suddenly, a Qatari plane pitched up at Sana'a airport. Nobody quite knew what was going on. 48 hours later, it flew out of the country with a Swiss lady. And the Qataris had basically been negotiating, facilitating contacts, and had managed to extract the lady. Now, the Qatari government tell us that they didn't pay any money. And the Yemeni government tell us the opposite. It's whatever happened, and I suspect, I'm afraid, money did exchange hands, quite a lot of it. This has probably supported Al-Qaeda's operations for another few months, if not a year to come. Last weekend, 2 Finns and an Austrian had been learning Arabic in Sana'a. Just before Christmas, they were in the most populated area of Sana'a and were grabbed in the full daylight and kidnapped. They again were passed on to Al-Qaeda. Not much news of them. In February, there was a video with the Austrian saying that he needed to be released, a ransom paid within a few days, otherwise he would be executed. Deadline passed, nothing more heard, until last weekend. They turn up on the Omani border and apparently in good health, and were handed over to Omani authorities. Again, everyone denying money's exchanged hands. Rumours in the media that up to $50 million on this occasion may have exchanged hands. That would be a new record if it was that much, though. Okay, so kidnaps and the consular aspect of trying to protect British people and our allies. Trade, investment and energy, you'll all be used to hearing a lot about this, how embassies these days need to do a lot to promote British economic recovery. We're doing our bit in Yemen, although a lot will depend on the security improving. The Bab el-Mandeb is at the gates of the Red Sea, is one of the busiest waterways in the world, and more oil tankers and commercial shipping passes around that waterway than any other part of the world. So clearly this is a critical area, and Iran has on occasion said that they are keen to secure the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, and actually the president of Yemen, his reaction to that is if they achieve that, if they manage to control those two straits, they don't need a nuclear bomb. They can hold the rest of us to ransom because they will have those key waterways. The reality is something will happen long before we get to that stage, but it's a thing to think about. Yemen has economic prospects, oil and gas, minerals. People play it down. People say Yemen's oil will run out in 10 years, but they've only prospected 8% of the territory. So I think as the security improves, Yemen's investment potential and economic potential for the UK will go up. Just another area, visas. Visas is a very interesting one, and with the migration debate in the UK, worth talking about because, of course, there is a natural tension between the desire of people like myself to get influential foreigners into this country so that they can be educated, come to excellent institutions like Queen Mary's, so that they can spend money in British shops, take their holidays, invest, and a tension between that desire to have people coming in and, of course, the domestic debate going on in Britain at the moment. Now, that's another area where the foreign and domestic are overlapping. I could talk a lot about the bilateral and multilateral and how that plays into this issue as well, the P5 role, P5 members of the Security Council, how policy which affects British people now is made as much in the UN and the EU as in Westminster, how debates spill over. There's a big debate going on in the virtual sphere on the use of drones at the moment to combat terrorism. Much more in the virtual sphere than actually on the ground in Yemen, interestingly enough. And I think it's worth flagging up the central role of the US in all this, as in so many things to do with foreign policy. A big part of my job is working carefully and closely with the US and the US military in country. This is often a challenge. Those of you who have worked with the US military know they are our greatest partners, but they do speak a different language. A US colleague actually pointed out to me the other day two bits on US kit which illustrated this. There was on a US rocket launcher, this is true, it was a quote which says, "Aim towards the enemy." And another one, apparently in the US military they have a phrase just to remind themselves what they're doing, which goes, "When the pin is pulled, Mr. Grenade is not our friend." So, we try to bring these cultures together. But I'm digressing, but I just wanted to flag up the importance of the US. And suffice to say that as the British ambassador in Sana'a, I need to keep good links not only to UK domestic foreign policy, UK domestic policy making in London and the UK, but also to key partners' domestic policy making. So, for instance, I spent a bit of time on the road last year in Brussels, and Washington, Paris, talking to key policymakers about Yemen, because we need to know what the mood is in their capitals, as well as what their diplomats are saying. A few years ago, there was a paper under the last government written by an enthusiastic young FCO planner, which screamed out, "We are all diplomats now!" exclamation mark. And what the paper was arguing was that all British civil servants who go to Brussels, who do anything related to foreigners, are diplomats. Now this caused, I'm not saying whether he was right or wrong, but this caused a huge furore, as you can imagine, certainly among the more traditionally minded FCO mandarins. And I think that I just mentioned that because I think it's worth asking the question, is there actually some foreign policy which is not yet domestic? And is there anything that diplomats do that is different from what civil servants do? Or are we all diplomats now? Question. So I've identified a few things where it does strike me that diplomats do something different from what most civil servants do. The first one is managing a bilateral relationship. And managing a bilateral relationship may seem straightforward, and in some countries it is. I think if you're in a nice, quiet, small country, it's probably a very straightforward and relatively pleasant experience all the time. But in a lot of cases, and I'd say most cases around the world, countries are complex things and behave in unpredictable ways, like people, because, of course, they reflect the people that govern them. And it's rather like, as one person put it to me, it's like keeping a plane flying. You have to keep it flying, quote, in the middle of the air. Because if you don't keep it flying in the middle of the air, you bump into things like trees, ground, mountains. And that is what a diplomatic bilateral relationship is like. I learned to fly in Morocco, and you'll be glad to say, John, I haven't pursued that habit. But I learned to fly, and it's a very difficult thing to do. And it's three-dimensional. And there are things popping up at you at all times from all places. And you need to be keeping that plane in the middle of the air. And it may sound straightforward, but it's actually sometimes quite challenging. And the way that diplomats do this is through tradecraft. And it's a different type of tradecraft from the stuff you see in Skyfall and other Bond movies. It's a diplomatic tradecraft as opposed to spycraft. And they're very different things. Because one of the key things about diplomatic tradecraft is being visible, being present. Now, obviously, that means being in the country for a start and living there. It means engaging with people at all levels, society, inside and outside of government. It means also being present virtually. And these days, the digital diplomacy effort is increasingly important. And the Foreign Office, I'm glad to say, is leading the way compared to most other ministries of foreign affairs around the world. We need to have constant exchanges with people. And we need to be in the media, present in the media. That's how you have impact. And you need languages to do that. Now, one of the things that is under threat, but I'm glad to say under William Hague, is being strengthened again, is the ability of British diplomats to use languages and for the government to invest in training them. So British diplomats still are among the best at using the language of the country to engage. And this makes a huge difference, as you know. Diplomats abroad are spotting opportunities. They're looking to how the UK can invest in the future of that country to the advantage, political, economic, security and other, to the advantage of the UK and its people. And I mentioned the importance of commercial trade diplomacy these days, and it's obvious that a part of the economic recovery of this country will depend on whether British diplomatic efforts overseas succeed in attracting inward investment to the UK, creating new jobs, and sometimes these investments from abroad, of course, can create billions of pounds for the UK economy and hundreds of thousands of jobs. So it's an important aspect. I think, I'll give you an example of the personal touch. I think that's the last thing I'd say about keeping the bilateral relationship warm. The personal touch sometimes matters a huge deal. And an example, my first posting in Morocco, my first wife, I call her that to keep her on her toes, my first wife and I had she's sitting there glaring at me, so I've got to be careful, had a dinner party. And we invited some very eminent people who we wanted to build a relationship for the embassy with. And served in a very lovely environment. We served strawberries and cream with a very fine sauterne. And it was the first time these people had ever had strawberries and sauterne together. And of course, those who know it is a great, exquisite combination. They never forgot it. The relationship between them and the embassy moved to a new level. And that was important. The personal touch matters. And that's what you can do if you're in the country and you can get inside, get on the inside track, which is much more difficult to do if you're just visiting or flying in. You'll remember Alan Clark at the beginning of the 90s. He said that the Foreign Office should be replaced with a fax machine. And I don't want to explore that statement too much. I mean, I think suffice to say that the Foreign Office as an institution is evolving, it's still there, moving on, even embracing new technologies. I'm afraid both Alan Clark and the fax machine are dead. So, QED. I think, apart from that, of course, Alan Clark, I've got a great admiration for them. A second thing I'd say is keeping Whitehall's eye on the ball is something that embassies abroad, posts abroad can do, and do in a different way from people based within the UK. Whitehall is easily distracted and by crises. It regularly has lesson learning exercises after every crisis, but so often then fails to implement them again. If you've got people who have been working on a region or a country for decades, sometimes all of their careers, these people actually are in a better position to remind people of the lessons learned from the last crisis in that region, to bring their expertise to bear in a useful way. And we saw a lot of that in the period of the Arab Spring. Right, I'm moving towards the end. The last thing I would say in terms of an argument in favour of actually having some posts abroad is that diplomats abroad try to anticipate the unexpected. And sitting in a different place over the horizon, they are sometimes able to see it coming before it reaches the UK, whether it's a crisis or an opportunity. As Tony Blair identified, the crisis abroad can impact on the UK. Just need to think about the economic impact of the subprime housing crisis in the US, or what happened after the Balkans and Afghan crises in terms of migration flows to the UK. Both very big domestic impacts here, which were generated from a crisis abroad initially. And I think when natural disasters happen, posts abroad are very important for consular reasons. In the same way, they can be prepared for events, even if they hope they never happen, such as the tsunami in 2004. Many Brits, of course, were caught up in that, many tragedies. But my colleagues in Thailand at the time spent a lot of time, sadly, going around morgues, identifying bodies, liaising with the local authorities, repatriating bodies, liaising with families, providing support. And they were able to do that immediately because they were there. And recently I had a case of this in Yemen. A UK citizen died in Aden. And then another totally unrelated incident, British merchant seaman on a boat in the Red Sea committed suicide. Now my consular team were able to liaise with the authorities, sort out a complex situation and support the families back home and fulfill their wishes in a country where, of course, the UK travel advice tells Brits that they shouldn't go. So very difficult for the family to do anything about that themselves. So this is a daily part of the work of an embassy. John, I'm sure you'll remember that Bismarck said there were 3 occasions when a man would lie. Not that you would ever lie, I know. But Bismarck said there are 3 occasions when a man would lie. When he's returning from a hunt, this is 19th century Bismarck, of course, when discussing the origins of a war, and when trying to get a woman into bed. Now, I think accepted wisdom would probably, in Britain, would add a 4th to that, which is also when sent abroad for one's country. Now, I'm not saying that I or any of my FCO colleagues have ever allowed a false word to cross our lips, of course not. But I think this point does illustrate that the demands on diplomats abroad and civil servants at home, they are different. The pressures are different, and therefore the responses are different. So just to conclude, and then I'm very much looking forward to lots of pushback, challenge and discussion, I hope. You'll be aware probably that Whitehall is increasingly working to create what we call a one team, capital O, capital T, one team at home and abroad. And what this means is joining up between the key departments operating in Whitehall on foreign policy issues, and then at post, joining up the people posted out there from the different Whitehall departments. So, for instance, I've got big teams from the MOD, from DFID, and from other parts of Whitehall operating there. The Foreign Office element of my embassy is very small. We run the platform. We try and hold it all together. That's part of our role. Try and make sure these teams work as one team. But it is a challenge. And I think it's a good agenda that the UK is pursuing. It's one that started under the last government, has been continued with enthusiasm under this government. And it provides a better and more effective response to foreign and domestic issues which increasingly overlap. And in the Yemeni context, as I've explained, I think this will help keep UK citizens safer, and it'll ensure their money is spent better. Because a vast amount of money, if you include all the aid and other elements and the cost of keeping an embassy, you're heading up towards £4 million in this present period per year committed by the UK taxpayer to Yemen. That's a lot of money. So I think it is worth this joint response. And of course, politically, a stable Yemen where security is improved, that will reduce the risks, as I've shown, a stable Yemen will reduce the risks to London commuters. So there is a direct correlation between the foreign and domestic now in a way that I think is fairly straightforward to understand. I hope so anyway. But at the same time, I would argue that the different approaches are needed for foreign and domestic policy challenges. Different approaches work better in the two contexts. And at the same time, for instance, I don't think serving sauternes and strawberries and cream to solve a miners' crisis in Yorkshire is going to help very much necessarily. Being a Yorkshireman, I can say that. And my last thing I'd say is that this points towards domestic policy actually requiring more, not less diplomacy to be effective. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah. Okay, just following Twitter and apparently hashtag awesome ambassador. There we are. That's quite nice, isn't it? That's quite nice.
Clearly not talking about me then.
No, yes, somebody else.
Somebody
else. Questions, please. Can you please identify yourself? Over to you. Who's first? That man there.
Peter Hayden, friend of the Mining Group.
Tell them what you really do, Peter.
I'm a brewer. This weekend there's another major example of the crossover between foreign and domestic. I'm of course referring to the Eurovision Song Contest. And there was a preview of this on the radio yesterday, and the previewers were saying, of course, it doesn't matter who Britain puts up because everyone's going to vote against us because they all hate us. Which recent years' results seem to bear out. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think that we in this country are isolated or insulated from the true perception that other people have of us, because obviously most of us only see the rest of the world when we're on holiday, and provided you've got money in your pocket, everyone's nice to everybody. And to what extent is your role to inform us of the truth, if there is a gap between what we think and what other people think, or insulate us from the truth?
Okay. Should I take a couple together, John, or do you want me to do one at a time?
Up to you. We got time. Do one.
Okay.
At a time.
Thanks very much. That's a good question. My memories of the Eurovision Song Contest are very positive, actually. The first time I was aware of it was there was a great song. Do you remember it? Save All Your Kisses for Me. Brotherhood of Man. And they came first. Do you remember that? I think it must have been about
Happily no.
I don't think my job remit extends to actually singing it for you, but it was, I think it must have been about 1976. And at that point, they didn't all hate us. I have noticed we haven't won many times since, although I'm not I don't watch every year, I'm afraid. I think your question is important because, in other words, do the rest of the world hate us and hide it when we're there because they want our money? And what should we be doing about it? I don't think they do. I think Britain's brand is still strong. It's actually improved in recent years. There is a campaign which has got mixed media, mixed receptions here, but abroad, the Great Britain campaign of the last 2 years, tied into the Olympics, has been remarkably successful. celebrating Britain's success, innovation, modernisation. The Olympics, I think, did a huge amount for Britain's image abroad and surprised so many of our international partners in all corners of the globe, including those who thought they knew us, like perhaps the Australians or the New Zealanders. They actually suddenly found that the UK was far more modern, had moved on, wasn't stuck in the post-industrialisation depression of the 60s and 70s, as it is so often the image of the UK, or has been until now. So I think the Olympics helped a lot. I think the UK brand is strong. In political security terms, we're still up there. We're still at the key tables in the right tents, and I'm talking there about the Security Council permanent members. When we lose that permanent seat on the Security Council, I think being a British diplomat will be a very, very different experience. So we must hold on to it.
You've just said when we lose it.
When, as in when if. He qualifies quickly. I don't think anyone in the British government system I've come across is suggesting we should even negotiate it. We should work, as you know, John, in my previous job I was working on the agenda of trying to expand the Security Council to bring in some of the emerging powers to make it more reflective of modern power sharing around the world. But in all those negotiations, the UK remains a permanent member. So we mustn't lose that seat on the Security Council. We have a leading role in the European Union. And we are a member of the G8. And long may it remain so. And we're the chairman presidency of the G8, of course, this year. I think the UK has shown in the last few years, and this started in previous governments as well, it's not particular to any political party, but I think the UK has shown an ability to reinvent itself. When I first joined the Foreign Office 24 years ago, the theme that was dominant in discussion of UK was the Dean Acheson question about UK having lost an empire, looking for a role. I think we've gone beyond that. I'm not quite sure when it happened. I suspect it may have been in the late 90s, possibly something to do with Tony Blair, actually, and the way he approached his premiership. But it's something that's happened sometime in the last 2 decades. I think we've moved beyond it. I think there's a new confidence, a new realism about our role in the world. We are not a superpower. Sometimes it's hard to know quite where we do fit in. What I would say is we're like France in many ways. That's our role in the world, and in some things we're very relevant. We've got a role to play. In other things, we just have to recognise we haven't got the resources, we haven't got the whack anymore, and we've got to step back and work through others. But I think we're feeling increasingly confident in our role. I think the brand is strong, and I think because of all that, we may lose the Eurovision Song Contest, but because of all that, I think the UK and the British people, as long as they don't get completely drunk in a Benidorm bar and smash the place up, apart from occasions like that, where I don't think the UK brand is very strong in Benidorm, by the way, but in most of the world, I think the UK brand is good, and British people are appreciated for being straightforward and decent people.
We haven't got the whack anymore. He's been spending too much time in the East End. Yes, please.
Andrew Cranfield, member of the Myland Group. I'm really intrigued by your home and away, foreign and domestic, and the one team concept, and your justification of the sub 4 million expenditure per year. Are you actually, well, there are 2 parts to the question. One is the funding under threat for your particular posting? And the second one, do you actually do a cost-benefit analysis in the broadest sense of our commitment to that region and your work there in total?
Yeah. The funding isn't under threat, I'm glad to say. The Foreign Office, more generally, like the rest of government, is committed to finding very big savings over the spending period. In some ways, perhaps we've been less heavily hit than some departments. We are not having to lose 30% or 40% of our workforce, like some Whitehall departments have. At the same time, we are reducing our headcount, and we've got to keep pushing it down. I think another 10% in the next couple of years is the target. We're not a big department anyway. You're talking only several thousand British diplomats. The budget and the budget is being pressurised downwards as well. We do have to find very real savings from a budget of just over £1.5 billion a year. But though I'm glad to say from where I'm sitting at the moment that the axe is likely to fall on areas where we're not doing cutting edge, what we increasingly call expeditionary diplomacy, which is what we're doing in Sinnar, which is where we are adding a lot of value at a relatively small cost, actually. I mean, if you compare it to, say, our American colleagues, they're adding more value, but are they adding 10 times more value, which is, their budget is probably about 10 times what my budget is? I don't think so. So for the moment, while the situation is evolving as it is in Yemen, while the UK is front and centre of that effort, the embassy budget seems to be relatively secure. We do try and find efficiencies each year. We have an efficiencies exercise. We offer things up, but we don't have to provide to deal with massive cuts. Cost benefit is always successive permanent secretaries of the Foreign Office go in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they have to defend the Foreign Office budget, and they're always asked normally by an MP who used to be an accountant before they joined the House of Commons. They're always asked for cost benefit of what that is being spent on British diplomacy. And Foreign Secretary, having supported one permanent secretary doing that at an earlier stage in my career, I know how difficult they find it to do that. Finding metrics to explain the benefits of having posts around the world is very difficult. So it tends to be more descriptive metrics rather than a pure cost-benefit balance sheet. I'm going in front of the FAC tomorrow myself, but fortunately I don't think they'll be grilling me about my budget. They're interested in the terrorism aspect at this point. But the reason why it's so difficult, I think, is obvious to see, and I don't see any likelihood of it becoming easier. And one of the ways permanent secretaries get out of this is by talking about the inward investment generated from a particular country. And in some countries, particularly in the emerging powers, it's not difficult for them to justify having a post in Brazil, for example, or India, where the amount of money flowing into the UK is climbing all the time, and how much the post has to do with that is arguable sometimes, but it's an easy metric. But otherwise, it's actually a very difficult thing to do, a proper, rigorous, accountancy-based cost-benefit analysis of foreign policy.
Richard Evans, a good friend of the Mile End Group and a headhunter. Nicholas, I'd like to ask you a very different question, and I hope you could be as open as possible, and you've just alluded to it. You, as a career civil servant, I think you left Cambridge in 1989 and presumably went into the fast stream, I would imagine would hope for a glittering ending career. Could I ask you a question that's in the news? Mm-hmm. What is your view about permanent secretaries becoming chief executives and distinguished senior civil servants like yourselves on 4-year contracts? Would you like to give a considered comment?
I'm not sure it'd be particularly career enhancing to give a very detailed answer on this one. Particularly if I'm going to aim for those glittering prizes that you tantalizingly dangled in front of me there. Let me deal with that one first, actually, because I think the public perception of diplomacy is inevitably lagging behind the reality of what it is today. The glittering prizes, perhaps of 10 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, are not necessarily the kind of glittering prizes that my contemporaries, even those who are nearing retirement now, would necessarily regard as such, and certainly aren't what people 20 years younger than me would necessarily expect to end up with if they have a good career. Diplomacy is shifting. More of a premium is being put on different things. Now, of course, anyone who ends up in Paris or Washington is right at the top of the profession, and it's still pretty glittering, even though they're serving sparkling English wine in the Paris embassy and no longer Paul Roger, I'm sorry to say.
Is that a cost or thing? Or
That's a perception thing, I'm afraid. That's a perception thing. But
it's probably cheaper the Paul Roger, actually. Okay.
well, we had a very good. I mean, if you're drawing me down that line, John, I'll come back to your question. Don't worry. Paul Roger was traditionally served in the British Embassy since the Second World War because it was Winston Churchill's favourite tipple, and he often stayed there, of course. And he'd started the day normally, like any civilised person at that period, harder to pull off these days, but he started the day with a bath and a glass of champagne. And he carried on. And people who've written histories of Churchill, you read what he drank during the day. I mean, phenomenal. So, you know.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, anyway, that's another discussion. The question about what do I think about permanent secretaries and chief executives being four-year contracts? I think in some instances it will introduce new dynamism, ideas, freshness, vigour. In some instances it will fail. And I think one of the pitfalls, one of the things that will need to be got across is the fact that if you're going to recruit, bring people in, say, from outside on a 4-year contract to head up a big Whitehall department, because you think they've got the skills to change it and do what the government wants to do with it, two things arise immediately. One is accusations of politicisation of the civil service, and you see this in debate at the moment. And that's a very real concern because I think one of the things about the British civil service, and this is where the civil service and the diplomatic service are exactly on the same page, is that they are not political. They're not politicised, rather. There's no party political activity within them. People are not promoted or demoted because of their political affiliations. You don't change jobs when the election swings another party into power. So that is one issue that needs addressing in that context. The other one is pay, of course, because pay and reward is a big issue in the civil service generally at the moment. There's been a pay freeze for the last 5 years of the senior grades. And I'll be passing a hat later. And the problem with, I'm not expecting anything.
The audience may coin you don't know.
The problem is that, of course, anyone of the stature ready to run a very big, complex organisation in the public eye, subject to huge scrutiny and pressures, which is the role of any senior civil servant, and particularly the permanent secretaries or chief executives, if you're coming in from outside, your likelihood is you're on a 6-figure salary, and you're going to end up in Whitehall. And the best you can hope for, the very best, is maybe a couple of $100 grand, and if it goes beyond that, that will be exceptional. Now, and I don't know whether they'll be able to attract the right people on that basis. We wait and see. I mean, the one thing about British government at the moment, and traditionally, is it somehow manages to keep most of the best things while experimenting and evolving. It doesn't always get it right, often gets it wrong, but the overall institutions are still strong, and I do have faith in the institutions and the good sense of the people who take the decisions about these institutions that actually, with the scrutiny of the British public and Parliament as well, they probably won't make too many huge errors. But this is an area of contention. I recognise that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, my name's David Lee. I wonder if the Ambassador could comment on where we are with the concept of the failed state. The reason I ask is I've been to Yemen 3 times, and it was a failing state in some sense, where it was sort of run and so on. There's a wonderful book just been published called The 10th Parallel, where right across the world, from the Sahel right through to Indonesia, Philippines and so on, the issues are swirling around to do with degrees of fanaticism in Islam and degrees of fanaticism in Christianity, and they can't stand the sight of each other. And the quickest way to heaven is to kill the other lot. Now, this is an issue swirling around, which is not a UN member, of which there are 200 in an embassy in Sana'a and somewhere else. There are more and more issues swirling around, which we don't get a handle on by traditional Foreign Office structure. Sounds a rather facile way of putting it, but perhaps you can comment on the question that's lurking behind what I'm trying to say there.
Okay. So if I've got that right, where is Yemen on the failed state indices at the moment, and how do we try and grasp this 10th parallel phenomenon of very complex, vicious issues flying around which don't fall neatly into the job description of a typical diplomat traditionally? Yeah. First of all, the failed state. I think the point of a lot of our activity in Yemen at the moment, and internationally, bringing the international support behind, is about pulling Yemen back from the brink of complete failure, where they were in 2011, and trying to ratchet them along the scale a little bit towards where they are functioning as a state. And they are still a failed state. To all intents and purposes. If the international community walked away, Yemen would collapse. Tribal conflict, terrorist conflict, Iran and others would step in and exploit the vacuum. So they're on life support. $8 billion worth of life support, actually, which was pledged last September in Riyadh at a donors conference. And the challenge we're now facing, with the UK very much DFID playing a very leading role in this, is how to design a mechanism that will get that money to the Yemeni people to support them and to do it pretty quickly so they can see the benefits of this transition. That's proving very difficult because old habits die hard in countries like Yemen, and working with the government of Yemen on this one is proving very challenging. But my hope is that if we reach the end of the political transition in February 2014 with elections on the basis of a new constitution, which is being looked at the moment, I think it is possible to see Yemen starting to stand on its own 2 feet over the next decade. But I mean, I say decade advisedly. I mean, this is a long-term project. This needs sustained international engagement. It's not going to be fixed overnight. And we need to be prepared, as in so many other cases, for the long term. Unlike Afghanistan, though, this is a smaller country, a smaller problem, with a tradition of democratic institutions, which never really work very well, but they have democratic institutions. They have political parties and a parliament and so forth. I think it is possible to see Yemen coming out of this and actually going forward. And if they do that, of course, that would then start to offer a model in some respects for other countries in transition in the region. And I hesitate to say that there's a blueprint there that could be imposed, say, on Syria in a few years' time. I don't think there is, but I think there are elements that can be taken from the Yemeni experience of moving from failure to function as a state, and that might be possible. But we're talking 10 to 20 years on this timescale. As for the 10th parallel phenomenon, in a way, that kind of analysis, that kind of to try and understand what is happening across, I mean, it's largely the Islamic world you're talking about there, not exclusively, but it's largely the Islamic world, and sometimes it's characterized as a Sunni-Shia conflict, which is it's to risk simplifying it too much. As a simply sectarian conflict. That's certainly a big part of it. But it's more than that. It's more than just Sunni Shia. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Iraq at the moment, for instance, that is a whole host of issues coming into play, partly due to the legacy of the last 10 years, partly due to the Shia minority now in power, looking more to Tehran than to the West or to more traditional partners who are Sunni. So there are examples of Sunni Shia division, but it's a very messy scenario. And I think the way that the Foreign Office, for instance, and our main partners such as the US and the French analyse this is actually a combination of in-capital expertise. So you drawing on think tanks which focus particularly on international issues. Bodies like Chatham House do a lot of important work on this kind of thing, but a whole range of think tanks, a lot of them in Washington, drawing on that kind of work, but also then drawing it together with the experts in post. And for instance, I have, among my team, I'm very fortunate, I have a guy who's been working on Yemen for 40 years, on and off, all of his career. And he's able to add a dimension to my analysis of what's going on, my understanding, and therefore London's and our partners, which is very valuable. So that doesn't really answer your question. I don't know if that gives you any reassurance. It's certainly a major challenge, is trying to get to the bottom of what is going on in all these countries of instability. Where's the next Mali? Where's the next southern Algeria going to be? I don't have the answer, but there are people working on it.
Hi, Ben Draper. Oh, sorry, I'll stand up so you can see me. Ben Draper, I'm a former student at Queen Mary. I just want to ask you about day-to-day life actually in the embassy, because you describe being sort of boxed up in a tin can inside a fort in a hot foreign country. How do you keep the staff happy? How do you make sure that everyone stays sort of comfortable and at ease and happy and therefore functional and productive? Because I imagine that's not easy when you can't sort of step out the borders of the compound and walk in the streets. I mean, the main reason I ask is just to tell a quick anecdote. My late uncle was in Peking, as he called it, in the 70s. He was a diplomat, and he describes not being able to set foot outside of the embassy for almost a year, because this was at the height of the Cultural Revolution, when Chinese people simply didn't talk to foreigners. And so on Christmas Day, they all 12 of them in the embassy clubbed together and put on a production of the 12th Night, because they couldn't get a turkey, they couldn't get any brandy, they couldn't get anything like that. So they had to sort of make do with what they had. So I'm quite curious to see how you managed that. Thanks.
It's a big challenge. And a large part of my job is to ensure that we look after each other and we look after the morale. And also of our local staff, of course, because the majority of the people who work in the embassy, they don't live there, but they are Yemenis who come and go. So in the conditions of living in Yemen, where there are checkpoints all over the place, it's very difficult to drive. Their families sometimes are under threat, and so on. And in extreme cases, because there is a huge humanitarian crisis in Yemen, over half of Yemenis do not have enough to eat each day. And in some cases, and I've been to UNICEF hospitals supported by the UK. There are lots of malnourished people, particularly children and women, babies, and the level of malnutrition is at the same level as the Horn of Africa. It's a hidden humanitarian crisis. It's not of interest to British media for some reason. It's probably not as picturesque, and it's a real problem. But and that impacts on, of course, how the morale of the local staff in particular. But there are simple things that people do, and the human spirit is very resilient, particularly the Yemeni spirit. But also, I'm glad to say, the British posted to the embassy are, not everyone jumps at the chance of living in a tin can for a year or a year and a half. So we tend to get people who are ready for it, or mentally prepared to an extent. There is training given of certain sorts before they get out there, I mean, particularly security training, but also awareness of what you're going into. And then there's a lot of mutual support among the teams. There's more. It sounds like your uncle had a tougher time, to be honest, because we can get hold of, booze into the country. I have to watch that they don't drink too much of it at once, because that can impact negatively on morale too if people are abusing it. But that's there. We do have reasonable food, purchased locally mostly. There are amenities. We've got Abu Dhabi Sports, which gives pretty much all the Premiership football matches and the Six Nations. So that's very popular and keeps people happy. We do the kind of things you don't actually necessarily do very often in maybe in the East End they still do it, John, but they don't do it so much in lots of parts of Britain, which is community events. You know, we do have kind of quiz nights, and there's a poker night and things like that, and so there is a community spirit. And when people start looking a bit wobbly, and I suppose I should have mentioned the most important thing is we do a rotation. So the staff are on a 6-week in, 2-week off rotation, and this puts us well ahead of actually our American and French colleagues who don't have that facility. And there's a thing called boiling frog syndrome you may have heard about, where the frog just doesn't notice that the water is heating up around him until it's too late and he's dead. We're all at risk of that in that kind of hostile environment. But I think by getting out every 2 months for a break, that reduces the risk. I see my American and French colleagues not having that. They're under much more pressure in many ways, although they live in a more normal environment in houses and things. So I think all of those aspects combined with this self-policing approach where we all keep an eye out for each other. And, you know, if someone's looking a bit wobbly, you know, we tell them, and maybe they'll go out a bit earlier. Normally about 5 weeks in, people are looking a bit grey around the gills. There's also a gym, and that's very used.
Yeah. Now, we've got 5 minutes left. I can see several hands in the audience. Alistair Campbell took about 27 questions at once. All right. It might not be quite as many as that. Please keep it brief. First one over here.
Thank you. Ian Beasley, Mile Group. Could I ask you to comment on the status of women in the Yemen and our attitude to it, and whether that makes our role in trying to influence the Yemeni society more difficult?
Yeah.
Okay. One at the front here.
Just interested, my name's Quentin, I'm a serving army officer. I'm just interested in the role that neighbouring countries, Saudi Arabia and Oman, you mentioned, play in the political process that's going on, whether it's an entirely benign influence or more malignant, as perhaps happens in Afghanistan and Syria.
Okay. Behind.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Harriet Doughty. I'm a student at Leiden University in the Netherlands. My question goes back to the budget that you have. I was wondering how much investment, if at all, there is in creating opportunities for young British people to get like on-the-ground experience in British diplomacy, like in your embassy, for example.
Okay. I saw some more questions. Yeah. Right at the back there.
The southern part of Yemen was a British protectorate and Aden, and then it became a Marxist state. Are there still secessionist pressures there?
And was there another question there? Oh, Christ. Wait till the end, don't they? Go on. Down the front here. Loud. Project.
So Debbie Willis, Hewlett Packard. You've mentioned the role of the military in the Gulf and also the need for humanitarian aid. Could you comment on the contentious issue of rebalancing the budgets between military and defence?
I can see one over the back there.
Jack Treacher, history student. You mentioned Jones earlier. I'm curious as to whether you agree with some commentators that although they may provide some strategic gains in the short term, whether in the long term they'll be counterproductive as they may radicalise further generations.
Is that it? Oh, there's one in the middle here.
My name's Karen Hussain. I'm from the National Archives. I was just wondering whether you would encourage further involvement of NGOs in this country. Maybe that would help bridge the gap between the cultural divide between people like yourself and people that live there.
Is that it? Is that it? Going? Go. Had to be. Gone. No, all right, go on then.
Tom Robinson, Queen Mary student. By any chance do you regret that first wife comment at all yet?
Okay, I should have cut him off, shouldn't I? But go on, carry on. Over to you, Nick. Nice and brief. We want to get to our drinks.
Deal with the last one first. No. Status of women. Big issue. Yemen is a deeply conservative country. UK doesn't pull our punches. We are leading the way at the political level and in developmental projects funded both by DFID and also projects funded by the FCO. We don't have a lot of development money, but we are putting money into women's projects as well. Because actually Yemen's future, and I often say this in public speeches in Yemen, Yemen's future depends on its women and children having more of a voice and a role in the country. Traditionally they never have. There are practices imported from the Horn. Those of you who follow the activity of the UK government and NGOs like Orchid, the Orchid Project on FGC, the UK is at the forefront of that work. We stick our neck out in a way that no other embassies are doing there. And if we can empower women in Yemen more, even a little bit, it will make a big difference. And there are some pretty impressive women there. Probably one of the few women who's made an international mark from that region at all. One of the few Yemenis people might have heard of is Tawakkol Karman, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. She's feisty, she's fun, she's young, and there are lots more Yemeni women like that. They need to be given a political platform and space to operate in, which at the moment doesn't exist. So we're prioritising that. Saudi and Oman, yes, and the GCC generally, I think I would say. They're mostly benign, and that is why the international support is working, because the GCC combined forces with the P5 and the European Union in 2011 to underpin the political transition. And we're all still bound in. There's a unique body called the Group of 10, the G10, which is P5, GCC and EU. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. If we could get the P5 unified over Syria, it might have possibilities in other countries, for instance. But at the moment, it is the cornerstone of any hope Yemen has of moving along that failed states benchmark towards to being successful. Saudi and Oman are playing, on the whole, constructive role, and Saudi in particular is key to Yemen's future. It's putting most of the money in, it's the bigger partner, and traditionally, of course, dominates the GCC. I think that Yemen will have a good future if it can recast its role with the GCC over time. Not necessarily become a member, that's a big ask. I told you about the discrepancies in economies and per capita income. It's a big bridge, but the GCC, and I'm encouraging people in Riyadh to think in these terms, they have a December summit, and I think that would be a great moment for the GCC to present a perspective for the future, for a closer integration with Yemen than they've got at the moment, and that in the way that the European Union offered to the Balkans and Eastern European countries when they came out of, when they were at the beginning of transition. And Saudi is at the key, is central to that. We do take young people to embassies around the world. There is a scheme that runs in a graduate scheme normally, but although I think people in their last year at university are also eligible, to go for a short-term attachment to British embassies in the summer holidays before they leave, enter the job market properly. We don't do it in Yemen, I'm afraid. You won't be surprised to hear that. We don't let anyone visit Yemen who works for the British government unless they've undergone particular training how to deal with crisis situations. So I'm afraid we wouldn't put students in risk. But it is a scheme run by the Foreign Office, details on the Foreign Office website, and it seems to work very well, and particularly targeted at attracting more diverse applicants to the Foreign Office, not just women, but minorities of all sorts, so that the Foreign Office staff represent more the diversity of British society. This is a clear stated aim of this government and the last government too. The South is still tormented by its past. It hasn't. Those of you who know Yemen's history will know that it achieved independence after 1967, when the British withdrew from Aden. It set up basically a Marxist state, the PDRY, which failed completely, but was propped up by the Soviets until they pulled out in 1990 because of glasnost and what was happening in the Soviet Union. At which point, a rapid unification of the country took place. Now, neither the PDRY nor the unified state has worked for the South. There are marches pretty much every week in favour of Southern secession at the moment. It's coming to a head in the National Dialogue Conference that's ongoing at the moment. The UK is playing a particular role because of our history there, and I and my Russian colleague, it's a slightly unlikely pairing, but we partner up together and we talk to leading Southerners and those people in this national dialogue and encourage them to stay within a unified Yemen, try and work out a system of federalism or autonomy or regional structures that will allow the Southerners to prosper and to redress the grievances of the past. This is an area where we historically have a lot of value to add, and the people of the South look to us too much. I mean, some of them, there's a group there who wants the Queen who say that the Queen is still their monarch, and they keep demanding that I go down there and rule them. And I've told them I'm not doing it. I've got enough to do. But also, of course, that's not the way forward for them.
I don't know.
But I'll send you down there, John. Yeah. But actually, they haven't clocked that how Britain has moved on. What I was talking about earlier about modern Britain compared to where we were 40 years ago. But actually, the future of the South, I hope, lies within a unified Yemen where they'll have a much more autonomous system of governance. They're very talented people from the south of Yemen. Lots of them in the UK. The diaspora is very big here. And actually, I do quite a lot we're talking about domestic and foreign, I do quite a lot of outreach to the south in places like Birmingham and Sheffield. Big domestic diaspora from the south of Yemen. DFID and the MOD elements of the budget. At the moment, it's not a big issue because DFID is not short of money. Because of the 0.7% commitment of this government, maintained from Gordon Brown's original commitment there. And we are, so DFID have a lot of money, and we're committed £310,000 dollars to Yemen for the coming couple of years in development terms. The MOD is going through transition, is probably what I'd say at the moment, and others in the audience are better placed to comment on that than me. But they are, they're able to post people in country. They're able to organise training and mentoring of Yemeni military counter-terrorist forces, and we're doing that. So at the moment, in Yemen, there isn't a tension between the DFID and MOD parts of the budget. Drones. You won't be surprised, I don't really want to say very much about that. I'm afraid it's a very sensitive issue generally. It's the line that British ministers have tended to take is that this is an issue that between the American government and the government of Yemen, who are the people who have agreed on the use of drones in Yemen and are the ones pursuing it. All I would say is, of course, although we're not involved in the drone policy or execution of it, the UK partners very closely in many other ways with both the government of Yemen and the US in prosecuting counter-terrorism efforts wherever possible, and particularly in Yemen. And then on NGOs' involvement to bridge gaps, there's been a proliferation of NGOs since I've been there. I've been there 18 months, and we've gone from a small handful. As the security situation has gradually improved, there are lots and lots of NGOs, and many British ones too, in country. They're doing a great job, and they do help bridge a gap between the political diplomatic effort and the people of Yemen. And they are, I'm glad to say, I went to visit a load of Oxfam projects in an area called the Tihama very recently, where people are starving and there is no state, and the only food they have is brought in by Oxfam. And thank God the British government and the British public are supporting those Oxfam efforts. So I've got a lot of respect and admiration for my NGO colleagues, who of course have far less protection or support from their headquarters than I do and my staff in the embassy. And they're very brave to be out there because they're at risk and they get kidnapped. much more than diplomats. But we at the same time, we don't want NGOs going there who haven't got a clear purpose, because they're putting themselves at risk for no reason. But overall, the NGO effort is going well in Yemen. Yeah. Have I got them all, John?
I think that was it, wasn't it?
Right.
Quite enough. So brings an end to Mylen Group 97. On Twitter, hashtag one of the best.
All right, that's good to know.
Think about that. Again, I was following somebody else. The 98th Mylen Group will take place on the 25th of June. This one partnered with the Treasury. This is Dave Ramsden, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Treasury, talking about the Euro and almost to the day, the 10th anniversary of why we didn't go in. So it'll be a party night, that one. Thank you very much for you all coming. There's a drink outside, and would you please join me in thanking Nick Hopton.
Thank you.